Well, good afternoon. This is the next installment of my video discussions of de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity. I'll be talking about the first three parts of Chapter 3, and I'm going to concentrate my explanation on de Beauvoir's very subtle, very complex understanding of the way in which freedom complicates our relationships with other people. The main problem an existentialist ethics faces, she says at the end of Chapter 2, is that it cannot seem to account for any universal value, any principles that hold across all human beings. If we are all free subjects, condemned to choose, if our commitments alone are responsible for things having value, doesn't that mean that there can be no binding obligations that link people together, right? There can be no genuine human values, things that we can all commit ourselves to. And so in the first three chapters or rather the first three parts of Chapter 3, she explores this issue by looking at the logic of political struggle on the one hand and the logic of freedom on the other. I will explain both of those processes as best I can in a moment. She begins, however, from a reflection on art, and she brings to light a certain paradoxical relationship between art and reality. The artist begins as a spectator. The artist observes the world. The great German filmmaker, documentary filmmaker Werner Herzog once said that the poet cannot look away. And the poet cannot look away from anything, whether it is a catastrophe of the highest order or whether it's simply the sun setting over the Caribbean. The poet, the artist, can't look away. And that becomes the subject of their art. But what if the artist makes beautiful art about the most horrific of human tragedies? Isn't that ethically abominable, she asks in the first couple of pages of the first part of Chapter 3? Doesn't that condemn art and the artist to inhumanity, in a sense? I don't think she uses the word inhumanity, but that's what's implied. And her answer is, no, it's not, because that is part of the real, right? Art is testimony. Art confronts us with the singularity of events, right? Things are not just examples or illustrations. This is reality. This is happening to that person. And the artist is there to testify that this is happening. The work of art neither celebrates nor condemns, it draws us in. Right? So art is not inhuman, even if it makes a beautiful portrayal of a catastrophic event. Right? Think of Camus' The Plague, which I've talked about before. Right? It's about the plague coming to an Algerian city. But it's really about the commitment of people confronted with the absurdity of nature. It just comes from nowhere and it's killing people. What do we do? Right? So the novel exemplifies commitment. It doesn't cause us to commit ourselves to anything. It can't force us. It doesn't say this is the right thing to do. It says here is what is done. Think about it. Right? So art is another confrontation with the real. And its justification is that it can lead to a more deep engagement between those who see the artwork who then go on to have to live their lives. It doesn't exemplify, right? It doesn't cause us to act. It draws us in. So the point of that introductory section, right, is to get us to think about different attitudes towards our experiences. On the one hand, everything can be like a movie and we watch it and it entertains us, right? Or it can be a call to really engage emotionally and intellectually and experientially, to draw us into our lives, right? And to make us want to commit to one way of acting rather than another. But, of course, this all occurs within the ambiguities of human life. And no one can guarantee no one can guarantee anyone will act one way rather than another. And no one can foresee the outcomes of our actions. Uncertainty and ambiguity remain, even if we approach the experiences of our lives in the way that she suggests. But then she turns to the problem of politics. So on the one hand, and this goes back to my comments about the first chapter. On the one hand, every human being is a subject, an agent, a chooser, someone who commits, somebody who values. Right? But on the other hand, we're also equally objects. From the perspective of other people, we are things. Right? And insofar as we are both subjects and objects, we can come into conflict with each other. Think back to Thrasymachus. Right? Thrasymachus said, the best way of life is to be a tyrant, because the tyrant dominates everyone else that they encounter. The tyrant is the subject, the chooser, the decider, and everyone else are like sheep, mere objects for the tyrant's purposes, projects, and pleasures. Well, what happens when the subjects become conscious of their having been reduced to the status of objects? Right? Don't they have to do the same thing to the tyrant that the tyrant does to them? Don't they have to turn it into an object and an obstacle and overcome it? And so not only is the problem that violence seems endemic to human life if we're both subjects and objects, but that there's no moral high ground. Because how do we condemn the tyrant? We condemn the tyrant because the tyrant objectifies the people it dominates. But in revolt, the people objectify the tyrant. The tyrant kills those who are recalcitrant and don't obey their will, but the people in revolt might kill the tyrant. And so there seems no moral high ground. Right? The tyrant is merely exercising their own freedom in being a tyrant. The oppressed are merely exercising their freedom as subjects in revolting. But everybody seems as guilty or as blameless as everybody else. And that seems abominable to de Beauvoir. We can't say that slaves rising up against the slaveholder are no better than the person who held them in slavery. So how do we avoid this false moral equivalence? And in order to get out of that problem, she takes us into a quite involved discussion of the logic of freedom and why, if any individual understands the meaning of freedom, they will the freedom of all people. Before turning to that difficult issue, let me just come to a couple of key passages in the text. I refer to them in the written notes, but I just want to read them out, or a couple out at greater length. So first of all, this is top of page 91, speaking to the issue I just raised. A freedom which is interested only in denying freedom must be denied. And it is not true that the recognition of the freedom of others limits my own freedom. To be free is not to have the power to do anything you like. It is to be able to surpass the given towards an open future. So let's focus on the first part for the moment. A freedom which is interested only in denying freedom must be denied. That doesn't seem to be coherent or consistent with her ethics of ambiguity. Why? Well, it's up to me, and me alone, to decide how my freedom will be lived. So if I'm like Thrasymachus, a tyrant, and I have the power to do it, who can deny me my freedom? Who can criticize me for doing something unethical, of some kind of moral or political crime? That's my commitment, that's my project, to dominate those I can dominate. But de Beauvoir says here, no, that's illegitimate, because your freedom is being exercised in a way that denies the freedom of others. And so when they revolt, you have nothing to complain about, nor can you establish a moral equivalence between the action of the oppressed in revolt and your action in oppressing them. Because what they are willing in their revolt against you is the freedom of everybody. They are not opposing themselves to your freedom as such. They are opposing themselves to the burdens you have placed on them. And free people cannot be expected to accept being imprisoned. And so there is no moral equivalence between the way in which people in revolt against oppression have to objectify, overcome, and sometimes even use violence against their oppressors, and the violence that the oppressors used. That's a misunderstanding of freedom. But this raises some very difficult philosophical issues, which we can only get at by looking more deeply into the issue of what it means to will oneself as a free subject freely. That's a mouthful, I know. Sometimes the existentialists sound like they're talking in circles, but I don't think they are. So let me try and unpack this. Just think of yourself for a moment, okay? And think of yourself as de Beauvoir and the other existentialists teach us we essentially are. Condemned to be free, having to choose, right? Having to choose life, having to choose commitments, having to choose to valorize something, but all without a safety net, right? There's no divine standpoint. There's no Platonic standpoint that we can access. There's just us, me and all of you. Okay. Now let's say you accept the burdens of that freedom. What is it that you will? De Beauvoir says that you don't will any particular state of affairs. Because, of course, no one can know whether their actions will turn out. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, as the saying goes. What you really will, when you will freedom as a free subject, is the maximal openness of the future. If any project is going to work out, right, to become a songwriter, to get married, to have children, to take a trip, once all of these restrictions on our ability to move have been lifted, right? What you're really willing is the openness of the future. What that means is that you're willing a future where one of these things can work out, or any number of things can work out. The tyrant, on the other hand, wills closure for everybody, openness only for themselves. But that is not maximal openness. What the tyrant is doing, and in a sense, Plato really anticipates de Beauvoir here, right? The tyrant thinks that they're willing freedom when they will only their own freedom. But what they actually do is condemn themselves. They trap themselves in their own megalomania. If we really understand what it is to will ourselves as free subjects, what we will is freedom itself, maximal openness, which means necessarily, according to de Beauvoir, we will the freedom of others. Why is that? If my project depends upon exploiting and oppressing you or a group of people, I am in fact turning you into objects. But objects are ultimately barriers. They are things that stand in my way, right? The table is supporting my coffee cup, right? But it also prevents me from moving easily to the side of the room. If I will to go around it, if I will to go to the other side of the room, I have to walk around the table or smash it to bits or something. The object is a barrier to my will. Now, there's nothing I can do in the case of the table. The table is just there. But what about other people? If I treat them as nothing more than objects, then that is what they are. I think they are things for me to use, but in fact I am constructing them or willing them as things that stand in my way, which contradicts what I want to do. I don't want anything to get in my way. So perhaps paradoxically, if I want maximal freedom for myself, I must will it for all human beings, i.e., I have to treat them as subjects, as agents, as valuers, as people with commitments that differ from my own but are of just the same kind. And so if I will the freedom of everybody else in willing my own freedom, they cease to be barriers to me. Right? Unless, of course, they will me as an object. But if all of us willed everyone else as subjects, as free beings, then insofar as possible, our activities would cohere. Right? We wouldn't all do the same thing, but we would all understand that we each have our own commitments and responsibility to our commitments. And we wouldn't objectify or dominate anyone else. And then we would have something like an existentialist ethic, which doesn't negate the ambiguities of human life. It doesn't negate the independence and reality of other people. Right? They could still be hell, as Sartre said. But we at least understand that existentialism is not nihilism, right? It doesn't permit us to do everything. The universe permits us to do everything, right? Nothing stands in the way of anyone doing anything or desiring anything. Only we ourselves can govern our desires and our projects. If we govern them, shall we say, rationally, right? Existentialism is sometimes called an irrationalism, but I don't think that's the case. If we understand our social reality rationally, if we understand that everybody is just like us, a subject condemned to be free and condemned to choose, and if all of us understand that, then we can will freedom in the will of any particular project that we might have. And we see that society has to develop towards forms of interaction and relationship where we don't exploit each other, where we don't oppress each other, where we don't treat each other as things. Now, there's lots of problems that could be raised, not least of which are political, economic, and historical. Not everybody chooses from the same standpoint, right? Some people have more power, some people have less. Absolutely they do. De Beauvoir would not disagree. After all, her most famous book is called The Second Sex, which is a critique of the history of patriarchy and sexism. She quite well understands differences of power. But how are we going to get beyond differences of power if we build those differences into our self-conception, right? If women, for example, internalize their own oppression, they won't will themselves as free subjects, even though they are. So what's de Beauvoir saying? Everybody, no matter what your social position, you are free subjects. Assert it. Organize and struggle against the structures. But at the deepest level, you yourself are the capacity to will yourself beyond whatever oppressed circumstance you have been placed in. No individual can simply think away constraints, but if they get in touch with their essential freedom, they will at least get beyond the ways in which the oppressor has constructed them. So internal to the idea of freedom, or the practice of freedom, better said, right? Think of freedom as a practice. Internal to that is willing the freedom of everybody, of all subjects. So let me again come back to the text for a second. Sorry, it's page 114, right towards the end of the third part. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's actually page 99. That is not the worst thing to be said for violence. It not only forces us to sacrifice the men who are in our way, but also those who are fighting on our side and even ourselves. Since we can conquer our enemies only by acting upon their facticity, by reducing them to things, we have to make ourselves things. In this struggle in which wills are forced to confront each other through their bodies, the bodies of our allies, like those of our opponents, are exposed to the same brutal hazard. They will be wounded, killed, or starved. Every war, every revolution demands the sacrifice of a generation, of a collectivity by those who undertake it. But that's forced upon us by circumstances. In the conflict, yes, we have to objectify each other. We have to regard other people as things. But they are not essentially things. And the goal of political struggle is to actually overcome oppression, right? To reconstruct society so that we can all relate to each other as free individuals. So, a little bit further ahead. Yes, first of all, page 105. One cannot, without absurdity, indefinitely sacrifice each generation to the following one. Human history would then be only an endless succession of negations, which would never return to the positive. All action would be destruction, and all life would be a vain flight. But it's not. All life is ultimately commitment to the goodness of life, commitment to one's own creative projects, and commitment to living in relation to others so that everyone, as far as possible, can make their own commitments and realize themselves and realize their goals in their own way. Right? So the goal of life is ultimately positive. So this is now page 112, top of the page. Human efforts and lives can no more be treated as blind instruments than human work can be treated as simple merchandise. At the same time as he is a means for attaining an end, man is himself an end, right? All human beings are ends in themselves, right? We are agents who posit goals for ourselves and realize them. In willing my freedom, I will everyone else's freedom, and therefore I treat everybody else as an end in themselves. Never just a means for me. Now, sometimes we can't avoid that, right? But essentially, other people are all just like me. People with goals and projects, people with value commitments who are striving to attain them. Right? And so then, finally, this is the cashing that out, top of page 114. Right? He says, she's saying, well, is it better to, in a conflict situation, is it better to kill one person or 10,000 people? She says, that's not the issue, right? No multiplication, she says, is relevant to subjectivity. We're all of infinite value as subjects. We can't add one life to one life to one life and say, well, 10,000 lives is of more value than one. No, every life is of infinite value. Again, sometimes in situations of conflict, some group of people is going to have to be sacrificed, right? Think of the horrible, horrible decisions that are being made in Italy right now. So this is not, abstract ivory tower philosophy. This is real stuff. But anyone who dies, right, in a circumstance like this, is of infinite value. The loss cannot be repeated. It might be explicable because of a lack of resources, but it doesn't justify it. It also doesn't condemn the people who make the decision, right? Remember, the ambiguity of human life is having to choose in a world where we don't always control the parameters. But when we think of life as an end in itself, right, we can't add and subtract the value of lives. They're infinite. They're of infinite value. And so then the question is, how do we positively relate to one another as of infinite value? And we'll come back to that issue in our conclusion in the next couple of days. So I'm going to leave it there. There are two sets of notes and discussions left, the parts 4 and 5 of the Ethics of Ambiguity, and then some selections from Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. I will treat those separately, so I'll post notes on each set of readings and post 2 video discussions. I've also begun sketching the final exam. I plan to have that posted by Wednesday. Just don't worry about it from between now and Wednesday. Go about your lives, pay attention, revalue the world, because we have an opportunity to really think about what's important for us and to us in these difficult circumstances. I think I found a way to come up with a final exam question that does justice to the work we've done without being unfair to anyone. But we will cross that bridge when we come to it in the next couple of days. In the meantime, if there are questions or problems, please email. I look forward to your papers. I'm happy to have meaningful work to do, so I don't just sit around and worry. Okay, I will talk to you in a couple of days.